Hello and welcome to the final lecture on Heart of Darkness in this course on gender and literature. So in the previous two lectures, we had touched upon some of the salient features of Heart of Darkness, some of the fundamental characteristics of a novel, and why is it important for the purpose of this particular course. We had talked about the background out of which this novel was produced, the cultural, political background, the ideological background out of which this novel was produced. And obviously, we talked about what happens inside the novel in terms of the content of the novel, the narrative structure, the story, the themes, how it is important in terms of looking at the novel from the lenses of gender studies. Now, what we'll do in this lecture, the final lecture on Heart of Darkness, is we'll look at the location of the woman in the novel, the location of the female in the novel. We already talked about a little bit on the various female figures who appear in the novel, who very seldom speak, who are lied to, who are misinformed to, etc. We had already talked about the very gendered nature of knowledge, manipulatable knowledge, certain knowledge which is very, deeply masculinist, which must not be given to the woman. And obviously, we also talked about how the women never speak in the novel. So they either are a very intimidating presence, a fearful presence, a fearful figure, or they are a very passive figure, a very passive consumer of male lies, a very passive consumer of male manipulation, as in the case of Kurtz's Intended, the white woman in Brussels, who Mulder goes back and lies to in terms of what happens in Congo. Now, in this lecture, because we've already touched upon some of the basic ideas in the novel, some of the fundamental features of the novel, we'll talk about a little bit in details in terms of the, and we'll take an overview as well in terms of looking at gender and imperialism. And then, of course, we'll sort of focalize into the novel in terms of looking at the different figures who appear in the novel and how they are masculinized and femininized, depending on their location and power. Now, to begin at the beginning, the relationship between gender and imperialism is quite straightforward as well as quite complex. Imperialism, as we know, was essentially a male enterprise. It was something which was completely driven by the profit principle of capitalism, the profit principle of mercantile economy, where the different companies, the different merchants, they branched out of the European shores in order to make more profit in elsewhere, and obviously by elsewhere the other places included, but were not limited to Asia, certain parts of Asia, and of course Africa. In the case of Heart of Darkness, we see the Belgians go to Congo with a very naked profit principle of making money out of the different resources of the Congo, chief of which was ivory. In the case of Heart of Darkness, it's ivory, which is the principal capitalist commodity, the imperial commodity, which is sort of shipped back into the white space from Africa. And obviously, once it comes back to the white space, once it comes back to Belgium and the heartland of Europe, it transforms into a commodity, it transforms into a domestic commodity, it transforms into some kind of an embellishment for the white people. Now, so what's important to see, even at a structural economic level, we find a transportation of a quote-unquote African product into the white European space. Now, interestingly, and many people have studied this in terms of looking at the imagery in Heart of Darkness, how it is the white ivory which is sort of found out in the black continent, quote-unquote dark black continent, which is a very stereotypical racist way to look at Africa. But interestingly and ironically, how this white commodity of ivory is found in this dark black continent and then shipped back into the white European space. And interestingly, how this wild object, ivory, the trunk, obviously, of the teeth of an how that is domesticated when it comes back into the European space. So the wild, untamable, exotic other is domesticated when it comes back into the heartland of Europe, into this white space, where it transforms into a commodity, into a domestic commodity, which is used as an object of embellishment. Okay, so even at the structural, superficial economic level, we find how this entire discourse of taming is prevalent in the ethos of imperialism. So taming an exotic object, taming a wild object, taming something which is outside, elsewhere, and bringing it back into the heartland of the white space, into the heartland of Europe, and making that into an object of consumption. Okay, so this entire taming of the wilderness, the taming of the wildness which is basically looking at it from a cultural perspective. So this exotic other is now brought back into the European space as an object of display and an object of consumption, etc. Now, if you remember, this kind of a discourse was prevalent, throughout the history of imperialism. So if you remember your Shakespeare, if you remember your Tempest, you'd find that little scene, and this is a bit of a digression, but it will help us understand the point I'm trying to make over here. If you remember your Tempest, you'd understand that when the two, Naples courtiers, Trinculo and Scrivano, they look at Caliban, they sort of think of him as some kind of exotic object with 4 legs, obviously a monster. But the primary impulse, the immediate impulse is to bring him back into England and other parts of Europe to display him as a commodity and with which they will earn money. They will make a profit with this visual display. So again, we find the entire ethos of imperialism was to sort of tame the exotic other, domesticate it, commodify it, bring it back, and consume it as a commodity. And that was obviously the driving principle which also influenced and informed the profit principle of imperialism. Okay? So ivory in Heart of Darkness becomes a very symbolic object. Right? And if you look at it from the lenses of gender studies, it's not difficult to see how that would work. So ivory becomes a metaphor for the other exotic female, right? The female other. Because I use the word female over here in conjunction to the ethos of imperialism, where male, female, civilized, uncivilized, black, white, and non-white, where there's very neat and blunt binaries, which informed the ideology of imperialism. So the moment I say female, the exotic female, the wild female, I'm locating that, if I'm looking at it from the prism of imperialism, I'm locating that as outside of civilization, as outside of the rational male logic, right? Now the whole point is to transform that into an object of consumption, right? To transform that into a commodity of consumption. So ivory, which is this exotic African other, which can be easily feminized, is now domesticated, it's now brought back for the consumption of the European male, the consumption of the European civilized rational self. Okay, so even the object, and this is the interesting thing, if you read it dealing with gender studies, the entire location of gender, the entire division of gender, the entire politics of gender is not just dependent on human beings. It's not just dependent on persons or selves. It easily spills over and translates into an understanding of objects. So certain objects are masculinized, certain objects are feminized. Okay? In this particular case, ivory is obviously the female object, is the object which is out there to be possessed, out there to be consumed by the white rational male. And obviously the entire Belgian occupation of Congo, the entire Belgian location in Congo, the territorialization of Congo by the Belgians was entirely driven by the profit principle of deriving ivory out of that particular space and shipping it back into the white continent for the consumption of the European male, the European rational self. So ivory is a very important metaphor of consumption over here, and equally is a very important metaphor the other way, gender plays out even in objects, even in commodities, even in non-living entities. Okay? So this is the interesting thing, and I sort of want you to pay attention to it as you read the novel at your leisure, looking at ivory not just as an object, but also as some kind of politics or othering, which is now domesticated and shipped back. And once it's shipped back, it becomes a domestic commodity, which is obviously available for endless consumption, visual or otherwise. Okay? So this is a very good example of how ideology and economy merge in imperialism, how ethos and economy merge in imperialism. And that was, this particular merge had always happened historically, right? So on one hand, obviously, the entire ethos, the entire politics of gaze, the entire politics of consumption is based on the ideology of othering, whereas whereby the European becomes itself the rational civilized self, and anything outside that territory becomes the non-rational uncivilized other. And that's one. And B, this entire ideology of othering, this entire ethos of othering is informed directly by the profit principle, the economy, whereby the other is now shipped back, transformed, converted into a commodity, and then classified as a commodity, and then consumed endlessly. And obviously that drives the profit principle which governed imperialism. Okay? So it's a nice loop. It's a very I use the word nice quite ironically, but it's a very nefarious loop. It's an evil loop, a sinister loop, whereby ideology and economy sort of feed each other, inform each other, feed off each other in a very interesting kind of a dynamic. And that has historically been the history of imperialism. So if you look at any history of imperialism, you find ideology and economy at a very interesting and sinister merge at all the time. And I talked about in one of the lectures previously how the history of imperialism, the genealogy of imperialism, sort of proceeds through 3 M's, if you remember. The first M is the merchant, the mercantile occupation, the mercantile presence. The second M is the military presence, which is out there to protect the profit. And the third M is the missionary presence, which is out there to convert and make the subjects into sort of willing subjects, make the people, the natives there, as willing consensual subjects who will not question the authority of the white occupation, who will not question the supremacy, the supposed supremacy of the white occupation in imperialism. So the 3 M's in imperialism are very, very important. But in the case of Heart of Darkness, we find it's just the first M which is out there, and obviously with some backing from the second M. So, and I mentioned this in my previous lecture, the Belgian occupation of Congo is a very interesting example. It's a very rare example where no effort was made, no attempt was made to masquerade as a civilizing mission. There was not even an effort made on the part of the white imperialists to make them feel a bit better about what they're doing. It was a nakedly economic exploitation, right? So it was out there for everyone to see, and it was just there for the profit principle, for the naked profit principle of imperialism. It didn't even pretend to be anything else. It didn't even pretend to be a civilizing mission. It didn't even pretend to be some kind of a missionary mission, whereby we tell people that we went there to rescue the natives who are barbarians. No such ideology, no such rhetoric was required in the case of the Belgian occupation of Congo. So as I mentioned, this is a nakedly economic enterprise, and Marlowe, obviously the narrator in Heart of Darkness, is an agent, an imperial agent, someone who works for a Belgian company, and equally someone who's sent out there, his job is to get Kurtz back, and Kurtz is obviously an imperial agent who had gone rogue. So I talked about Kurtz in the previous lecture, how he becomes a very interesting case of masculinity. He is a product of this European, metropolitan masculinity, who's sent to the imperial other, the other space, the terra incognita, and over there he cracks up. Over there he sort of becomes a rogue masculine self. He turns his back to the imperial project and becomes a problem to the project, so much so that another imperial project has to send someone to get him back, to retrieve him. Okay, so the location of gender in Heart of Darkness is very, very important. The location of the male, the men and the female presence in Heart of Darkness is very, very important. And equally, we're not just talking about the human beings away, we're talking about the commodities, we're talking about the landscape, we're talking about the natural presence, we're talking about the objects. So all these things are masculinized and feminized in the course of the novel. So we talked about how Congo, the river Congo, if you read the descriptions that Marlowe uses in River Congo, it obviously becomes a symbol, a metaphor for the other female, So you're sort of flowing into Congo endlessly. You're surrounded by a wilderness you don't recognize. It's completely unfamiliar to you. And so this exotic other, the other space that Congo becomes in the novel, is a very good example of a feminization of the exotic other space. You don't know the logical coordinates, you don't know the rational coordinates, you don't know the geographical coordinates. So the entire Eurocentric understanding of geography, the entire Eurocentric understanding of nature, the entire Eurocentric understanding of landscapes and presence, so all that collapses as Marlowe floats into Congo. And obviously the entire presence of Congo becomes a bit of an amniotic presence. An amniotic because of the female othering self, and it becomes excessive, amniotic, it's wild. So in other words, if you look at it from the lenses of gender studies, it's something that a white man doesn't understand. It's something that a white rational man would fail to understand. And an entire novel, you could read the entire novel as a failure of understanding. And obviously when I use the word failure of understanding, I use the word understanding as a located category. It's not a universal category. So, when I say that Marlowe's logic fails in Heart of Darkness, Marlowe's reason or the entire rationality of Marlowe fails in Heart of Darkness, I'm not talking about rationality or reason or logic as universal categories. I'm looking at these things as Eurocentric, male, phallogocentric categories. And I used the word phallogocentric previously. If you remember, it's a combination of phallocentric and logocentric. It's the male logical principle. And when I say male logical principle, what I obviously mean is it's a white European male logical principle. And this entire white construct, this construct of whiteness, this construct of white rationality, this construct of white logic, it fails, it collapses in Heart of Darkness quite spectacularly. An entire novel is about this particular collapse, right? So if we're looking at the novel from the lenses of gender studies, it's important that, along with looking at the human figures who appear in Heart of Darkness, who don't speak, who do speak, and how they're embodied in the novel, is equally important for us who want to study this novel from the lenses of gender studies, to look at these categories like knowledge, landscape, nature, these non-human categories, in other words, and how these are, broken and divided and subdivided into male and female categories of understanding. Okay, so with this kind of overview, let's dive into the novel. Let's look at the novel. Let's see what happens in the novel in terms of, and if you can dig up more, interesting readings out of Heart of Darkness in terms of looking at it from the lenses of gender studies. Okay, now obviously the novel is about a man called Marlowe, who was sort of sent as an imperial agent. He works for a Belgian company, and he's sent to work for the company in Congo, and he goes there to do his job, and then the entire novel is about how he gets more and more disillusioned, how he gets more and more confused, how he gets more and more unsettled by his imperial experience. And in that sense, it's quite relatable. You can connect it, interestingly, to George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, because that too is about the unsettling of the white European male. When the white male goes to this non-white space and looks at imperialism as a dirty thing. He recognizes that imperialism really is a dirty job. It's nothing glorious about it, it's nothing romantic about it at all. Okay, and this entire knowledge of this evil of imperialism generates cynicism, generates disillusion, generates despair, and most importantly, it generates guilt. So both Heart of Darkness and Shooting an Elephant is about the white man's guilt to a certain extent. It's about the white man getting too close to imperialism and looking at imperialism from too closely. And once you see it as what it really is, you cannot unsee it anymore. You've seen it too well, you've seen it too close to unsee it, to forget about it. You can't unremember it anymore. Okay? And Marlowe, the entire crisis in Marlowe, it almost becomes a neurotic crisis, an existential crisis, is about his inability to forget what he had seen, his inability to unsee what he had seen. And at some point in the novel, he actually tells his audience, do you see the story, right? And it's important, do you see the story? He's not saying, do you listen to the story? Are you listening to the story? He's almost trying to make an appeal that it's a visual thing. I'm trying to tell you, I'm trying to show you what had happened to me in Congo. I'm trying to tell you what had happened to me in Congo, but in a way that should appear to you as a scene. So his entire question is, do you see the story, right? And obviously the audience cannot see the story, and that's the whole crisis of narration in Heart of Darkness. He cannot narrate to the audience what had happened to him in Congo. And that informs his masculinity crisis to a certain extent. Because remember, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, and I sort of winded up that lecture in this note, Heart of Darkness is also, along with many other things, a failure of the classic realist tradition of narration. Okay, so if you look at Heart of Darkness as a classic realist novel, because the kind of narration that Marlowe wants to generate, Marlowe wants to use to convey his experience in Congo, is a classic realist narration, is a classic realist tradition of narrating. Now obviously that classic realist tradition of narration is very, very Eurocentric. It depends, it has this presupposition that the narrator knows everything. The narrator has entire knowledge of before, present, before, now, and after. It's omniscient narration. The narrator knows everything in terms of what's happening in other people's minds. The narrator knows everything in terms of what are the intentions of each character. Now, obviously, it is a myth. You can never know it. You can never know what happens in another person's mind. You can never know, entirely what happened to you in the past. You can never know what is happening to you at the moment, and most importantly, you can never know what will happen to you in future. So this entire idea of classic realist narration is basically a fantastic construct. It's a construct of fantasy, and I use the word fantastic quite literally over here, right? Now what Heart of Darkness does among many things. I mean, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, it shows the constructed nature of logic, it shows the constructed nature of Eurocentric understanding, it shows the constructed logic of imperialism and the supremacy of the white man's supremacy in a non-white space. But equally, from a literary level, and it's important because we, at the end of the day, we are literary students, and it's important that they locate the novel as a literary work. Equally, Heart of Darkness is about the constructed quality of the classic realist narration, right? It's about, it's sort of telling you, showing you quite spectacularly that a classic realist tradition of narration is a construct which will fail if we're using it to narrate an experience which is outside the European space, right? So the entire story of Heart of Darkness is a story that happens in Congo, in outside Belgium, outside Europe, outside a white civilized space. And obviously, if we're using the white rational instrument of narration to talk about non-white experience, this is going to be completely incommensurate. It's going to be completely incongruous because they're using a tool, the narrative tool, which is informed by European logic, European rationality, European reason, but in using that tool to talk about a non-European experience, a non-European space, a non-European landscape, and that's not going to work. It's completely incongruous. And among many things, Heart of Darkness is about the incongruity. The incongruity between the medium and the matter, the form and the content, right? The content is non-European, the content is outside of Europe, where the form that Marlowe is trying to use, the manner that Marlowe is trying to use to deploy in Heart of Darkness is a classic realist tradition, which is failing, right? So that's one of the many reasons why Heart of Darkness is such an ontologically dense novel. And it takes you such a lot of time to read it, despite its brevity. It's a 90-page novel. Some people call it a novella, but it takes an enormous amount of time to read it, and it's precisely because it's about the failure of narration. It's a narration which is constantly deconstructing itself. So it's not a linear narration. It's not something which you can passively consume because it has a beginning, middle, and end. It's a narration. It's a kind of narrative structure which is basically about breaking itself as a narrative structure. So in that sense, it's got a self-destructive, self-deconstructive quality. But obviously, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, the Heart of Darkness, or Joseph Conrad, does not celebrate this deconstruction. He's lamenting this deconstruction. He's mourning this deconstruction because he's a very conservative writer. Remember, he's a very conservative. His position politically was very, very conservative. So he's lamenting the loss of the Eurocentric structure of narration, right? So he wishes, I mean, there is almost this nostalgic understanding in Marlowe that if only this had worked, if only this classic realist tradition had worked, and he realizes that it's not working. He realizes that his style of narration is failing, is collapsing. And also, if you look at it from a gendered perspective, the entire classic realist style of narration is very, very phallogocentric, right? It's very male-centric. It's very white European male-centric style of narration, and that is failing, right? So like male reason, like male logic, like male rationality, like male in a way of understanding, the white male understanding of nature, the white male understanding, the white male manner of narration too is failing in Heart of Darkness. So like ivory, which I just talked about ivory and how ivory is feminized in the novel, how that is appropriated by the masculine profit principle and consumed by the masculine profit principle. The narrative in Heart of Darkness too is basically a hysterical narrative, right? So it starts off, it's supposed to be a male, rational, controlled narrative, but it becomes more and more hysterical. It becomes more and more emasculated. It becomes more and more nervous. So it's entirely a nervous, neurotic narration in Heart of Darkness, right? And in that sense, it is a very interesting study of gender, because the very narrative of Heart of Darkness is ungendered and then regendered. So Marlowe ends up being a hysterical man. And hysteria, as you know, was traditionally, at that point in time at least, was classified as a female malady. And Ellen Showalter has got a magnificent book on this. It's just called A Female Malady. If you want to know more about the history of hysteria, that's a book I would recommend by Ellen Showalter, The Female Malady. It talks about hysteria and how that was, in a very sexist kind of a way, it's medical sexism, how that was sort of classified as a female disease, and men never had hysteria, presumably. But Heart of Darkness is about male hysteria. Heart of Darkness is about how the male narrative structure fails. It sort of deconstructs itself, neurotically, in its attempt to tell the story about what happened to the man outside of Europe. And obviously it's a failed attempt, it's a nervous, neurotic attempt. And so the very narrative of Heart of Darkness is a nervous, hysterical narrative. And in that sense, it's an emasculated narrative. So the entire idea of classic realist narration, which has this marvelous overarching logic, where the narrator knows exactly what happens before, now, and after, in the presence of other people's characters, in the presence of the character's mind, everything is known, everything is understood, he has absolute knowledge of everyone. That entire hubris, that entire arrogance of male understanding fails in Heart of Darkness. So Marlowe is a very different kind of a narrator in Heart of Darkness. He's a nervous, hysterical male narrator. So in that sense, the narration in Heart of Darkness, like Ivory, is a very gendered kind of an entity. Okay? So we talked about the ivory in Heart of Darkness, we talked about Congo in Heart of Darkness, and if you contrast Congo with Thames, the river Thames in London, you find they're very two different kind of rivers. So, but interestingly, Marlowe makes a connection at the beginning in Heart of Darkness that, this too was once, before civilization. Right? So he's referring to the point in history where London was uncivilized, quote unquote uncivilized, before the entire Enlightenment, before the European movement, the entire European understanding of civilization happened. London too was just another dark space. Right? And this is interesting because he begins the entire novel by talking about London as saying, this too was once one of the dark spaces. This too was once what Africa is now. So what is interesting in Heart of Darkness is the mutability of what we call civilized and uncivilized. Is the historical mutability, is the changeability. What is civilized today can become uncivilized tomorrow, and equally what is uncivilized today can become civilized tomorrow. So again, the point is to move away from the absolute understanding of civilization, to move away from the absolute understanding of reason, of supremacy, of logic, of rationality, and to have a more relativistic understanding of these categories, a more relativistic understanding of civilization. So what is civilization now can become uncivilization tomorrow, and equally what is not civilized today can become civilized tomorrow. It's all about the historical genealogy, it's about the movement in history, right? So Heart of Darkness in many ways becomes a very interesting commentary as well as a critique of an understanding of civilization, right? And one of the many things that a novel does, interestingly, is it looks at these kind of categories as non-universal categories, as I mentioned, right? Logic, reason, narrative structure, knowledge, civilization, supremacy, racial supremacy. So all these things which, imperialism was trying its best to promote as universal categories, and obviously it did it mediated through Enlightenment. So Enlightenment and imperialism were very interesting bedfellows. They basically informed each other, as I mentioned. The ideology and the economy informed each other. They fed off each other. They influenced each other. They created, they constructed each other in this magnificent enterprise of looking at imperialism as some kind of a civilizing mission, some kind of a good mission, which is not nakedly profit-making, right? But obviously what Heart of Darkness does, it cracks open this nexus. It cracks open this very, very nefarious nexus between ideology and economy. And it shows you, the economy principle in Heart of Darkness, the Congo in Heart of Darkness is a naked economist exploitation. It's basically an exploitative space where the white imperialists were settled with the sole motive of making profit. There's no other motive at all, as I mentioned. There's not even a guise, there's not even an attempt to masquerade as missionaries, to masquerade as some kind of a civilizing presence. It's just there to make profit. It's just there to exploit economically, to take the resources and convert those into commodities and ship those back to the European metropolis, where those will be consumed endlessly by the European consumers. Okay, so the river Congo in Heart of Darkness is gendered. The narration in Heart of Darkness is gendered. The ivory in Heart of Darkness is gendered, and obviously Marlowe himself is ungendered in some ways. And this is the next point that I'm going to make. Now, like Kurtz, Marlowe too is an imperial agent. And when I use the word imperial agent, obviously the automatic expectation, the automatic assumption is that the imperial agent must be quite masculinist. Because imperialism is a masculinist principle. It was entirely based on the profit principle of logic, rationality, profit-making, expansion. So it's all about economic expansion, it's all about economic invasion, it's all about conquest, territorialization. So all these are very, very phallogocentric principles, very, very phallogocentric performances, very, very phallogocentric categories, right? Invading another space. making profit, this expansionist principle of economic profit. So all these are very, very phallic, male, masculinist kind of understanding of life, of economy, of civilization, etc. Right? So when I use the word imperial agent, the automatic assumption would be a man who is basically in conformity with this kind of logic, with this kind of an economic system, with this kind of an exploitative system, this kind of a logical system. And Heart of Darkness gives you two men. Well, there are many men in Heart of Darkness, but the two principal men in Heart of Darkness are obviously Kurtz, Colonel Kurtz, and obviously Marlowe, the narrator. Now, both are imperial agents, but both are basically, they both crack up in different degrees. Now, Kurtz cracks up in a way which becomes a threat to imperialism, which becomes a threat to the very system of imperialism which had created them historically, right? So here, if you look at the descriptions of Kurtz in the Heart of Darkness, we almost know nothing about Kurtz. We almost know nothing about how he looks, what he is, what he does. But we do know, and the novel makes explicitly clear, that entire Europe went into the making of Kurtz. Now, when I say the entire Europe went into the making of Kurtz, it's very tempting to look at Kurtz less as a human figure and more as a symptom, more as an extension, more as an extreme extension, an extreme embodiment of imperialism, right? So he is less of a human being and more of an extreme embodiment, more of a symptom, which becomes a pathological symptom, because he becomes a diseased presence in Heart of Darkness, a diseased presence who dies in the end by uttering the horror. It's something which consumes itself. It's got a self-consuming kind of a quality about it. Okay. Now, when you look at Kurtz as some kind of an extreme extension, an extreme embodiment of imperialism, it perfectly falls in place. Because, then what we are doing essentially is looking at Kurtz as an extreme example, an extreme extension of the masculinist principle of imperialism. The profit principle, the expansionist principle, the economy principle, the greed principle. It's the principle of greed, the principle of lust for power, of territorialization, etc. So it becomes an extreme extension of all these principles, right? And this extreme embodiment is so nakedly present in Heart of Darkness that he almost generates a sense of guilt, a sense of shame, a sense of unease to the European imperialists. The European imperialist center is now uneasy with him, because now it's very nakedly evident that he is an extreme embodiment of all these naked profit principles, of this evil principles of imperialism. And now it becomes uneasy for imperialism. Now it becomes uneasy for imperialism in terms of dealing with him, right? Because he is now becoming a nakedly rogue agent, right? So Kurtz, one reading of Kurtz could be he's less of a human being and more of a symptom, and more of a condition, a European condition during the times of imperialism, a condition which is informed by an overdrive of greed, an overdrive of profit principle, an overdrive of expansionist principle, an overdrive of this entire rationality principle. So the point is, if you push all these too far, if you push this entire imperialist greed, imperialist rationality, imperialist profit-making principle too far, this entire masculinist project, if you push it too far, what you get is Colonel Kurtz. What you get is a cracked up entity, someone who cracks up, someone who completely breaks up, and then becomes a problem, right? So he very quickly transforms from perfection to problem. And this is the entire idea of looking at Kurtz. So he starts off as a perfection. He is the best that Europe can have. He is the best that Europe can make. The entire Europe went into the making of Kurtz, as the narrator keeps telling you in the course of the novel. So he is the example of perfection in the novel. He's a perfect agent, the perfect imperial agent. But what if you push perfection too far? What if you push perfection to the extent that it becomes a problem? And that's exactly what happens to Kurtz. So very quickly, he converts from this masculinist perfection to a hysterical problem. So it becomes a hysterical problem to such an extent that, now the European imperialist center has to send someone to get rid of him, right? So he's turning into a monster. He's turning into a rogue. He's turning into a problem. It's very similar. And again, you can make connections with novels such as Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, where too the entire ambition, the entire drive, the entire lust is to create a male progeny which is absolutely perfect. So, I'm just making a bit of a digression over here, but it will help you to understand what the point I'm trying to make. So, Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel, his desire is to make a transhuman progeny, which will be perfect, which will embody the perfection of the human species to such an extent that, it'll do away with the female presence, it'll do away with the female requirement during procreation. So the entire project is a male project, it's a bioscientific male project, and the idea is to make the perfect progeny, the perfect offspring. Now, obviously, that goes terribly wrong. And the reason why it goes too wrong, because, it goes too far. So, the perfection goes too far in Mary Shelley's novel and Victor Frankenstein's experiment, to the extent that, it very quickly converts from perfection to a problem. It becomes a monster. And the word monster, obviously, is a metaphor for excess, it's a metaphor for aberration, it's a metaphor for departure from the normative principle, it's a metaphor for departure from deviance, from the norm, etc. So the monster in Victor Frankenstein's experiment is a departure from the norm. So it's too much of a perfection, it's too much of an extension, it's too much of an extreme extension. Now, it is so extreme as an extension that it becomes a departure. The same happens with Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. He's such an extreme embodiment of the imperial project. He's such an extreme embodiment of the imperial mission of profit-making, of territorialization, of expansion, etc. Now it becomes a departure, to the extent that now it becomes a monster, in the very same way as Victor Frankenstein's progeny becomes a monster. So you can make these connections very well. And obviously, Mary Shelley's novel is a very strong, it's a magnificent feminist critique of this entire bioscientific, phallogocentric experiment. Again, it's very, very phallogocentric. It's about a male white scientist trying to control the world, trying to create a progeny, trying to create a system which will not require the female biological presence anymore. So the entire life-giving process can be done in a scientific lab, which again is a very white male space of reason, logic, scientific understanding. And that's the whole project in Victor Frankenstein's effort. And he wants to make human beings out of a lab, which will not require females anymore, which will not require the mother figure anymore, which will not require any kind of female intervention anymore. So the entire idea was to do away with the female. The entire idea is to extend the European male understanding of rationality and scientific logic to the point that it becomes a self-perpetuating system. But of course, that experiment goes terribly wrong. He creates what is a monster because it's a radical departure from the norm, and then it becomes a problem, and then he wants to annihilate it, he wants to kill it. The very same way, and this is a parallel that you could draw on, this is a parallel that you could write on probably as parts of your assignment, as parts of your written projects. And if you want to make that into something more sophisticated, something more elegant, you can also consider writing a paper on this, a comparison between the male desire in Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel and that of the imperial desire in Heart of Darkness, and how both desires go terribly wrong. Both desires get disrupted, get unsettled by what they produce. So Kurtz is a product, Kurtz is a produce of the imperial mission. So he's this extension, the extreme extension of the phallogocentric imperial principle. And then it's such an extreme extension that it becomes a rogue presence, it becomes a diseased presence, it becomes a pathological presence, to the extent that another agent has now been sent to get rid of him, to retrieve him, to bring him back if possible. Now, again, if you watch the film based on Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, which is a magnificent film directed by Francis Ford Coppola, it's got really a very interesting setting. So the setting is Vietnam War, the U.S.-Vietnam War, this notorious war the U.S. had in Vietnam, and how Colonel Kurtz in that kind of a setting is a perfect soldier. He's a perfect embodiment of the military, the U.S. military. Now he's so perfect, now it's such an extreme extension of that perfection that it becomes very quickly a problem. He turns against the system which had historically created him, and now he becomes a renegade soldier. He becomes a rebel. Why? Because he's such a perfect example of an extension of that kind of a system. Okay, so and I do recommend that you watch the film Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, because it's a different setting, though it's not Congo. It's sort of contextualized in a modern setting. So the setting is the Vietnam War, but the principles are the same. It's white European. It's not European anymore, it's American, but again, it's white territorialization, it's white imperialism, it's white invasion, with the sole motive of making profit of controlling a non-white population, or making them into willing subjects. And obviously this is about greed, this is about the overdrive of ambition, territorialization, the male desire, etc. So it's perfectly connectable. The Congo condition in Heart of Darkness and the Vietnam War condition in Apocalypse Now is perfectly relatable. There's a lot of structural similarities, a lot of thematic similarity, and that's the reason why it works so well as a film, which is an adaptation of the novel. Okay, so now to come back to the main point that we're sort of talking about, we're dealing with in this particular lecture, the gendering of objects in Heart of Darkness, the gendering of entities, of figures in Heart of Darkness, and how one figure, and this is interesting, how one figure, is mutable in terms of the gender politics. So, for example, Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, it starts off with being this perfectly European male figure, this perfectly European phallogocentric self, constructed by Europe, constructed by European imperialism, etc. But now, once he's in Congo, he becomes a problem in the sense that he becomes the other. And obviously, as I mentioned a little while ago, the other is always female. In the prism of imperialism, in the politics of imperialist gaze, the other is always feminized. So in a very interesting sense, Kurtz is also feminized. He becomes the other of imperialism. So from an insider, he transforms into an other. So he quickly converts from a phallogocentric insider to an exotic other. And he's quite exoticized as well, by the way, in Heart of Darkness. So we never get to know how he looks like. It's a very nebulous, shadowy kind of a presence in Heart of Darkness. We never get to know his physical details, his physiognomic details. We just get to know he's almost like a spectral presence, a shadowy spectral presence. He's a spectre which haunts imperialism. It's quite literally, and this is in connection to the reading we just did of looking at Kurtz as a symptom, as a condition, a pathological extension. So he becomes less of a human being and more of a spectral, shadowy, pathological presence in Heart of Darkness. Okay? So this is an interesting condition in Heart of Darkness that we need to look at. And also Marlowe, the narrator in Heart of Darkness. So he starts off with being this phallogocentric, male, white European male in Heart of Darkness. But observe how in the novel he is very quickly emasculated. He's very quickly hystericized, right? So he becomes hysterical. He's a hysterical, neurotic narrator in Heart of Darkness. Who can't quite understand, doesn't quite know how to go about his narrative, how to produce his narrative in a logical, rational way. Which will make sense, which will be available as a commodity to its listeners. So an entire Heart of Darkness is about the failure of converting your story into a commodity, the failure of converting your experience into a commodity. And this is interesting because in this sense, in this tradition, in this reading, Heart of Darkness completely deconstructs or goes against the contemporary novels which are written at that time, the contemporary adventure novels which are written at that time, which basically relied entirely on converting the exotic story into a consumable commodity, right? So if you read Rider Haggart's novel written at that time, which are basically male adventure tales about imperialism, about this exotic other, and how everything is very neatly defined, neatly binarized, civilized, uncivilized, black, white, logical, illogical, etc. And that becomes a very consumable commodity. That kind of storytelling, that kind of a storytelling tradition, that kind of a narrative tradition is very quickly consumable, is very quickly consumed as a commodity by the European listeners. Now that doesn't happen in Heart of Darkness. It's to a large deal, to a great extent, it's about the inability to convert the experience into a narration, to convert the experience into a narrative. So in that sense, is a failure of the phallogocentric project. It's a failure of the masculinist project, right? So in that sense, Heart of Darkness is a very interesting novel to look at how the entire project of imperialism, the entire phallogocentric understanding of imperialism fails as a structure. And if we look at the woman in Heart of Darkness, if we look at the female presence in Heart of Darkness, they never speak, the African woman never speaks, no African speaks in Heart of Darkness, which is one of the reasons why a lot of post-colonial critics such as Chinua Achebe have had great reservations about this novel. They've treated this novel as some kind of a racist novel because Conrad doesn't make any African speak. But let's not take any side over here because that's not what we're doing. We're not doing this as a post-colonial reading. But it's interesting. It's important to understand that this novel was written at a time when most of the stories about Africa, most of the stories about Asia, most of the stories about non-European spaces were exotic stories, were stories about the exotic Orient or the exotic African other or the exotic dark other, etc. Now, in that sense, Heart of Darkness is a very interesting departure because it's not about exoticization at all. Right? It doesn't exoticize Africa. It basically looks at Africa as an ununderstandable entity. You can't understand it. And this failure of understanding is also to a great extent the failure of European logic, the failure of European rationality, the failure of European reason. So more than anything else, it's not really so concerned about Africa as it's concerned about Europe, Heart of Darkness. It's a very spectacular novel which basically tells you that entire system of rationality, logic, reasoning, these are constructed systems. These are very topical, local systems which will not work once you get it out of the context. Okay? So in that sense, it's a very interesting novel. And obviously, Conrad doesn't make any African speak. Obviously, the entire gaze in Heart of Darkness is a white European gaze, right? So it's a white European looking at the dark continent, looking at the dark, sort of quote-unquote black continent as a Heart of Darkness, etc. So that is all true, that is all there. But equally, it's a gaze which also looks back at Europe. It's a gaze which also looks back at the entire construct of Europe, European civilization, European rationality, and then reveals all these things as hollow things, as the entire idea of imperialism, the entire idea of civilization, the entire idea of enlightenment are revealed to be hollow categories. And in that sense, this is the reason, this is a very good way of understanding Kurtz's dying words, the horror, the horror. Okay? So that's something you can think about, that's something you can explore further. What does Kurtz mean when he says the horror and the horror when he dies? These are just the two things he says in the entire novel, the horror, the horror. Now, one reading of this, the horror and the horror, is an understanding, the knowledge of nothingness with which Kurtz dies. Because mind you, Kurtz is very much, or was very much, an insider in imperialism, an insider in enlightenment logic, an insider in the European system of reason and logic and rationality, etc., etc., etc. Now, once it converts from being an insider into an outsider, that conversion, that transition, that movement is also accompanied by the knowledge of nothingness, by the knowledge that he doesn't know. He knows now that all these entire lovely ideas about imperialism, civilization, logic, rationality, these are hollow ideas, right? These are ideas which are constructed ideas. These are ideas which can be deconstructed, which can be blown away in the face of other experiences. And this realization, this knowledge of nothingness, is what generates the horror in Kurtz, right? So it is basically the European male looking at itself as a dying entity, okay? And I use the word male as a metaphor over here. The European male, which is basically a construct of reason, rationality, logic, etc. And that basically begins to deconstruct. And it's literally the dying words. So you know what I mean when I say the dying words. It's the dying words of the European phallogocentric system, which had historically informed imperialism. So again, we're looking at Kurtz not as an object, not as a human being, but as a system, as a symptom, as a condition, right? A condition which recognizes its own defect, a condition which looks back at its own system and recognizes and reveals it to be a faulty system, to be an evil system, to be a hollow system, right? And so literally it's the dying words of the Eurocentric logical system, the horror, the horror. So and this is a very interesting way to look at Kurtz, and I would encourage you to explore it further and look at Kurtz as an example, as an embodiment of this hollowness, as an embodiment of the knowledge of hollowness, as an embodiment of a condition which recognizes civilization, European civilization, as hollowness. Okay? So in that sense, it falls in perfectly, it falls in place perfectly in terms of looking at Kurtz as a symptom, as a pathological presence, as a condition. Right? A condition which looks back and comments on the entire European discourse of civilization, imperialism, enlightenment as hollow discourses, as constructed categories of knowledge, right? And that's why he comments, that's why he says the horror when he dies. So these are literally the dying words of an insider who now knows too much, who now knows too well that these constructs are in the end constructs. Okay? So in that sense, again, there's a degree of emasculation, there's a degree of breaking away from the male mold, breaking away from the phallogocentric mold, because that kind of mold, that system is not revealed to be a faulty system, is not revealed to be an evil system, not just faulty, an evil system. It's a deceptive system. However, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, when Marlowe comes back, because he too has a glimpse of the hollowness, he too has a glimpse of the aura. So he knows too, like Kurtz, he knows too that the entire system of imperialism, the entire system of this profit-making principle, this expansionist principle of economy, etc., is a very evil system. He knows that too. But when he comes back, interestingly, to the European space, he cannot talk about it freely. So he can try, he can make an attempt, he can make an effort to tell this to his male interlocutors. And again, notice a very homosocial, this very, very male-centric understanding, this very male-centric attempt to impart a story. So what happened in Congo to Marlowe can only be told to men. That's the assumption, right? So it can only be told to male interlocutors, to male listeners, because it's something only the men would understand. And that's the assumption, that's the presupposition that Marlowe has. So he floats in a little boat in Thames in London, and he talks about his experiences in Congo to a group of men who couldn't care less. They're bored to death. So most of them go to sleep in the course of the story. Only the main narrator, the narrator who's telling you the story of Marlowe's story. So it's got a Chinese box structure, as I mentioned. And again, in that sense, it's very closely related to Frankenstein, because that too has a Chinese box structure, as you know. So Robert Walton tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, and then there's a story of the monster, etc., etc. So all that is quite structurally similar in Heart of Darkness as well. But the point is the knowledge that Marlowe has, and this is something I did talk about in the previous class as well. The knowledge that Marlowe has, the knowledge of nothingness that Marlowe has from Kurtz, that is a knowledge which presumably can only be transferred, can only be conveyed to men who can consume it. Now, of course, the men don't understand it. The European men who haven't been to Congo, they don't understand it, except the narrator who makes an effort to understand, presumably, because he tells us a story, presumably, in that politics of narration. But the interesting thing is, when Marlowe goes to the woman, Kurtz is intended in Brussels, in Belgium, there, he has to lie about Kurtz's dying words, because she asks him directly, categorically, so what were his dying words? She wants to know the dying words of her fiancé, and Marlowe has to lie to her. Marlowe has to tell her that he died with your name on his lips. So he doesn't tell her his dying words for the horror. So he died with your name on his lips. And again, by your name, when I look at the entire presence of Kurtz's intended, so she becomes again a metaphor of this misinformed female, of this manipulated female in Heart of Darkness. Someone who's manipulated by the men, someone who's lied to, someone who's misinformed, someone who is sort of comforted in a very deceptively by the men who want her not to know. So again, at the level of knowledge, epistemologically speaking, so we have an example of epistemological deception and a knowledge-based perception, right? So she doesn't get the knowledge of what happened to the men in Congo, what happened to her intended in the Congo, what happened to her fiancé in the Congo. So she gets a very romantic report. And again, the romantic report that she gets in the end is a deceptive report, as we all know, because we have read the novel, we know what Kurtz had gone through, we know what he had wanted to say, we know what he meant by the horror. The horror, we can speculate on it. He definitely did not mention her in his dying words. Now, having said that, there is an ironic truth in the statement that Marlowe is giving to Kurtz's intended, right? So when Marlowe tells Kurtz's intended that he died with your name on his lips. So if you look at your name as a metaphor, by your name, if you look at it as the female presence, the white female in Europe, right? If you look at this reading in that way, where Kurtz is dying with the name of the European female, the European white female in his lips as he's dying, that becomes ironically true. Because the European female, as we just realized, is an example, is a metaphor of a presence which is deceived, right? Which is manipulated, which is tricked, right? She's tricked into believing into something. And again, in that sense, she becomes a hollow presence, right? She's someone who's lied to incessantly. She's someone who's deceived incessantly. She's someone who's tricked incessantly. So in a way, she becomes a metaphor of deception, of someone who's deceived, a metaphor of a false life, a metaphor for a lie, a metaphor for hollowness. So in a very ironic kind of an inversion, this becomes almost ironically and paradoxically true, perversely true. So I'm talking about paradoxically as a perverse example. It's perversely true that Kurtz did mention, I mean, this is exactly what he meant. He meant the hollowness of European logic. He meant the hollowness of European knowledge. He meant the hollowness of European reason. And Kurtz's intended becomes an embodiment of the hollowness, because she is this helpless, passive female who is lied to by the European male agents. So you can see the binary over here, the male and the female. The men have the knowledge, the women don't have the knowledge. The women are not given the knowledge. The women are denied the knowledge. The women are lied to. The women are manipulated by the imperial agents. So they become the passive consumers of the grand narrative of imperialism, right? The grand narrative imperialism, which is romantic, which is noble, which is civilizing, which is out there to do great things for the world, etc. So they become the helpless, passive consumers into this kind of a discourse. So the entire thing becomes quite tragic. The entire thing becomes quite sickly tragic, because the men have to come back and lie, and that is obviously very pathological. And the women are just receiving these false romantic reports. And this entire system becomes what Kurtz says, the hollowness of European imperialism. So just to conclude, we looked at imperialism from different standpoints, from the ideological standpoint, from the political standpoint, from the colonial standpoint, from the imperial standpoint, and all these are connected if we look at it from a gendered standpoint, right? Because imperialism is a very gendered enterprise. It relies entirely, almost entirely, on its masculinist motive of profit-making, expansion, territorialization, etc. Right? So that motive is revealed to be a sinister, evil, hollow motive, because that is what it exactly is. It doesn't have any ideological, backing. It doesn't have any righteousness on its side. It doesn't have any kind of nobility. It doesn't have any kind of goodness in him. It's just an evil enterprise. And so the entire idea of the European goodness, nobility, rationality, logic, civilization, etc. So all these discourses, all these constructs are revealed to be hollow constructs entirely. They're ontologically hollow, they are philosophically hollow, they are completely hollow categories of knowledge. And this knowledge of hollowness, this knowledge of nothingness, is what Kurtz meant when he said the horror. Okay, so the horror, because it's a very gendered kind of a thing. It's about this entire deconstruction of the European masculinist understanding of life, right? And obviously, this is something which is related to the female as well, because they are lied to, they're misinformed, and the presence of Kurtz is intended as this very passive consumer of falsehood, this very passive consumer of lies that come from the imperial peripheries. So she becomes an example of the European insider who is lied to by the imperial agents, who come back and lie to them about what happened in the colonies, about what happened in the imperial outposts, and they get a romantic report which helped them perpetuate their belief that imperialism is a grand civilizing mission. But of course, we know better. Of course, Marlowe knows better. Of course, Kurtz knew better. And the entire knowledge that it is not a grand enterprise, the entire knowledge that it's not a noble enterprise, this constitutes the horror in Heart of Darkness, right? And it's a very gendered kind of understanding. It's a very gendered understanding because it's also an example of ungendering, as I mentioned. This entire masculinist construct of knowledge, nobility, are all ungendered. It all breaks down together in Heart of Darkness, and that constitutes the horror in Heart of Darkness. So in that sense, it's a very neurotic novel, it's a very dark novel, it's a very grim novel about the collapse of imperialism as a grand narrative. Right? So I hope we got some understanding of Heart of Darkness. I would encourage you to read the novel in more details, using the theories, using the understanding that we just discussed from the lenses of gender studies. So I hope you produce a good, you write something on it, hopefully a paper, hopefully some assignment, but more importantly, hopefully this will give you an understanding of an imperial novel, looking at it from a gendered perspective, and you can so really generate rich readings out of it if you look at it that way. Okay, so thank you for listening. Thank you for attending this particular class. This concludes our reading of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. We'll now move on to the next text in this particular course, which will be a short story called The Fly by Catherine Mansfield. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for your attention.